All right, I hope you guys can see my screen and hear me loud and clear as well as see me.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So let's start off. And I think first of all, welcome to this session on designing apps and reports that are accessible to all. Just a quick intro. I'm Priyansha Mishra. I'm a partner technology strategist at Microsoft India. I've been at Microsoft for 2 years, and my role really, makes me the jack of all trades, queen of some, because I tend to play around with a lot of technologies across all solution areas of Microsoft. I also call myself a citizen developer because I love to build things, and I love building reports and apps that are really solving problems internally as well as externally. So that's really a passion project that I spend a lot of time building some of these Power BI reports and Power Apps and really playing around with the platform quite a lot. So really today's session is more to do with not just building these apps and reports, but making sure how these apps and reports work for everybody that can be a possible user of these apps and reports, right? So let's before I really deep dive into the Power BI side or the Power App side, or even what does accessibility really mean, let me present to you a quick scenario, right? So let's imagine that you need to clean the floor, and you have been given a vacuum cleaner, but this vacuum cleaner, um, did somebody say anything? Sorry.
Yeah, please mute yourself so that there's no disturbance. Later on, you can ask the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kamlesh. So, yeah, so you have a vacuum cleaner, you need to clean the floor, and the vacuum cleaner's extension cord is not long enough, so you're not really able to clean the entire room, right? So you're able to just clean some spots, and then you're given a mop really to, do the cleaning, and then you get your, bin to lift the garbage, and you have some other alternate arrangement to do that, but that takes you twice as much time to really clean the floor, right? Instead of really effectively and easily cleaning it with a vacuum cleaner, you now have this broom and you have some other equipment that's really not performing the job at the same speed with the same amount of efficiency, right? So really, in this scenario, do you think if somebody was given a vacuum cleaner with not enough extension and a replacement that's probably not as effective, do you think they'd come back to clean this floor? Right. So just imagining that scenario, I think I'll put that into the context of accessibility, right? So when we build these apps and reports and we don't give the people that extension cord to really make sure that, it is accessible to all of the people around the globe, and it is not just for the 90%, but how we are also designing for the 10% that will improve the overall experience. So if you look at it, most of us maybe think about accessibility the wrong way, right? So we look at accessibility from the context of ourselves and how well it would work for us, right? But we really have to change our lens in a way to make sure that we are, whenever we're building and whenever we're building apps and reports, we're putting our users at the center of that experience, right? We're always trying to see how it can be good for the users who may not be like us, who may not have the same abilities as us, who may not perceive the reports and apps the same way as we do. So moving on, I think just since you've joined this session, there might be a certain notion that you may have already about accessibility, right? And the common notion that tends to be around accessibility and building for disabilities and people who are disabled, we look at it more from a medical point of view, right? We tend to look at disability as more of a medical condition. But what we really, need to look at, again, change the lens here and look at it from a social conditions and how a disability is really, the societal barriers that we raise for people with different kind of abilities, right? So somebody who is in a wheelchair, it is not just that, they have that medical condition where their legs are not functioning, but it's also the social condition on how our society is built to cater to most people who can walk on their legs, right? So it's a need to change that mindset and see how we can build out and break these societal barriers to make sure that our apps and reports are really accessible to the whole spectrum of people. With that, I think I'd like to introduce you, and we'll talk more about this in the subsequent slides. But let me just quickly introduce you to this concept of universal design. So, this is really the core concept when it comes to accessibility, when we're talking about designing of products that are usable by as many people as reasonably possible without the need for any kind of special adaptation or specialized design, right? So, whenever we are talking about accessibility, we would want to keep this conversation of universal design at the center of it. Now, that's a broad overview of how accessibility matters in the world. Let me just maybe narrow down on that and think of it from a technology lens, right? And consider it in this particular scenario. We, at the current stage, are more connected than ever in our work, education, daily lives, and that's all because of technology, right? Technology is connecting people in, communicating, learning, and experiencing the world. And now more than ever, with the current work from home culture, the remote culture, it has never been more important to focus on how we include everyone and ensure they can be productive, right? So we have remote working, learning, and information sharing that can be more difficult as digital content and platforms are not always accessible. So accessibility is really the vehicle to enable that inclusion of people with disabilities. And the fact that it's all remote, we may not be able to perceive that through a remote platform, right? So while we're talking to somebody remotely, we may not be able to perceive who is at the other end of the line, who is receiving my content, who is on the other end as a user, as an end user of my reports or apps. And that's why we really want to focus on this. So over the last 3 decades, we've learned that when the technology is inclusive, we can really connect people and information in incredible ways, and we can drive that innovation for everyone so that really everybody can achieve what they want to achieve. Just as an example, and we always talk about how this inclusivity and accessibility eventually also drives a lot of innovation. How many of you are perhaps aware of a straw? Anybody in the audience, probably with a show of hands, can you tell me how many of you guys have actually used a straw in your regular lives? Okay, I don't see any hands. Okay, I see one. Okay, I see a couple of hands raised. All right. So the straw, really a fun fact, was actually designed to cater to people with disabilities. It was really built for hospitals to really help people with, restricted mobility to consume fluid drinks. And now it's such an important part of all of our lives. And that really, conveys the point of how when we're designing for the whole of the audience, we just make the experience better for the 90% as well. When we design for that 10%, it is really catering to that entire spectrum. And we're not just talking about how we make it better for people with different sort of abilities, right? So let me drill down to what really would be accessibility in that sense, right? And what exactly would be accessibility? So as you think about an accessibility journey, it can mean different things to different people, right? But when some people think of accessibility, they think of designing buildings, structures with accessibility in mind, or making sure they follow certain accessibility compliance standards. You may also think of digital accessibility, what we just talked about, ensuring that people are connected to other people and information, that they have user interfaces that are customizable and adaptive to their needs, right? But really, at its core sense, accessibility is about enabling people to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve, right? It's about letting people fully participate and contribute. Ultimately, it's about creating experiences that are better for everyone. And really, AI can add that layer, right, for us. And when we talk about it, accessibility will really for each person, we'll say how we can add that layer of personalization to each person's individual needs. And at Microsoft, when we look ahead, we see tremendous possibility here, right? So AI has the ability to change what's possible for people with disabilities. And in the past, and this is really profound, in the past, if you had to adapt to the world, right, because of your nature of different abilities, in the future, the world will adapt to your individual needs and preferences. And that's pretty much what we're trying to do at Microsoft with the different range of products that we're building, keeping accessibility in mind. Right. With that, let me also briefly talk about, the different types of abilities that we're trying to build for, right? So accessibility is trying to empower people with disabilities at work, school, and in daily life. And this is across the full spectrum of disabilities. So this includes vision, right? So accessibility tools and features for people who are blind or colorblind or have low vision. This can include a larger screen, a brighter screen, and a screen reader to read text, right? We also talk about hearing for those who are hard of hearing, have hearing loss, or have deafness or specialized feature, that can provide solutions including closed captioning, mono sound, and live call transcription, right? A lot of which is already available in our platform Teams. Neurodiversity, innovative tools such as dictation and Windows Hello sign-in that can make the world more accessible for those who live with dyslexia, seizures, autism, or cognitive disabilities. Then we have the learning disabilities. Our applications are also for people who have learning disabilities, and how we can help increase focus, concentration, and understanding, and include tools to really improve reading and writing skills. We also, build up products around mobility, which is basically to help people who have arthritis, spinal cord injuries, or other mobility issues to navigate the digital world in non-traditional ways, right? And finally, on mental health as well. So we have supportive technologies for people who have mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder, anxiety, PTSD, depression, ADHD, right? So our products can help with focus, organization, and help improve, overall well-being and work-life balance. So that's pretty much how we're catering to the entire spectrum. Now, this is a very important slide, and as we move ahead in our discussion today, I would want you to keep these in mind, right? Because whenever I talk about how we are building a certain report, or how is a particular feature working, or how we would want to build it a certain way, I would want you to envision it from the shoes of somebody with one of these disabilities, right? How would somebody with low vision, or perhaps of issues with focus, perceive this on the other side of the table? And really, this is a very foundational slide for what's to come in the rest of the session, right? With that, let me quickly move on and talk about accessibility. While we talked about it from a responsibility point of view, it is also an opportunity, right? So there are over 1 billion people in the world who have disabilities, many of whom need assistive technologies, but only 1 in 10 have access to the products needed. And this means that many of them can't fully participate in our economies and societies. So basically, accessible technology can allow them to really fully participate. I'd also want to point out, like I said, it's important to know that 70% of disability is really invisible. So you don't always know what may be a challenge for those around you, right? We tend to hear this from people, right? So we don't have anybody in our surroundings who has a disability. So maybe, we don't need to keep this in mind. But at the same time, it may not be visible to you, but they actually may have a disability that is really invisible. And finally, remember that disability, whether temporary, situational, or permanent, is something that can affect any of us or someone we love at any time. And this is really alarming. And the reason why I'm also pointing this out is we've often seen that, the people who really are passionate about this, who keep this at the center of it, who think of it as important things in their lives as designing products or designing apps or reports, are the people who have either seen it with somebody close to them, or have experienced it themselves. But it's really important for us to empathize with people, and it can really happen to any of us. It can happen to somebody around us as well, and we must build for the entire spectrum and not think of it in ways that, we've not seen it around us, and hence we can't empathize. So it's really important to keep that at the center of the conversation as well. Like I said, it's an opportunity, and if we don't design for accessibility, it's like saying to every fifth person who walks into your door that I don't really want your business, or I don't really want you as an end user, right? So we're really missing out on a huge spectrum of the people if we don't really design for accessibility. With COVID-19, this situation is more important than ever before, because the disability community has been disproportionately impacted by unemployment and challenges with remote education, right? So the pandemic has amplified the need for people to have access to accessible technology at work, home, school, and play. So you can see the disproportionate impact that is highlighted on my screen, where 1 in 5 workers with disabilities have lost their job, 35% of special needs children doing little to no remote learning, right? And a bunch of headlines that are showing how the impact has not been proportionate across the globe. We also see that the increased demand for accessible technology, which has come out because of this situation, right? So there are a bunch of numbers, showing how within the first weeks of quarantine, our disability answer desk received 200% of normal call volumes. Our immersive reader experienced 560% of normal use, and Teams captioning usage was up by 30 times from a few months prior, right? So really at Microsoft, we're seeing that our disability community is seeing that, in the current scenario, there is a lot of increased demand for accessible technology. I talked about this before, how inclusion drives innovation for everyone, and this is something we all must keep in mind, right? So we have seen in our experience that, at Microsoft, we've seen that inclusion drives innovation for everyone, and whether we are struggling with a pandemic or not, it is a myth that accessibility impedes innovation, right? So designing with and for people with disabilities leads to greater innovations for everyone. We all benefit from inclusive design. So I'm excited to show you the many innovations already available from Microsoft, but really let's start with products that might even be more familiar to you, right? I talked about the bendy straws, which were widely used by restaurants everywhere now and have become a viable business after they were ordered by hospitals to help their patients with limited mobility. We have a bunch of other products that are shown here, but I just mentioned a few, like television video captioning, right? So basically, this was started for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but now this is widely used everywhere. And people who don't have English as their native language, English as a second language, really rely on subtitles in a lot of videos to understand what's being communicated. Another thing, voice recognition technology, which was really developed in the late 1970s at rehabilitation medicine in New York for patients to operate their wheelchairs, is now available in everyone's phones and cars, right? And my Alexa is sitting right there. Your, Google Assistant might be sitting somewhere else. We have a Cortana everywhere. So the voice recognition technology, which was really developed for people with disabilities, are now very, central to our experiences, our everyday lives, interacting with different technology around us. So that's really how we've seen inclusion drive innovation for everyone. And there's also that fact of inclusion driving innovation, but we also know that exclusion can result in decisions that don't work for everyone. And just taking that example of bendy straws again, they are an important tool for people with limited mobility in daily life, right? And they are sometimes a primary method that help them eat and drink, especially when out in public. But in many countries around the world, and we have seen this in a lot of countries in India as well, that there has been a push to ban plastic straws, right, as part of the environmental movement. But reducing the use of single-use plastic is important, right? I'm not denying that in any way. But by banning them outright and not including people with disabilities in the decision making, some cities and restaurants have just made it challenging for people with limited mobility to eat or drink, right? So really, we were not just building for them. We really need to think of them when we think of it from the decision making perspective as well. Um, I think this statement is really bang on, and it's something that has struck with me for a very long time, right? So I think Satya said this at one of our conferences, saying that accessibility must be built in and not bolted on, right? So one of our biggest learnings has been that accessibility needs to be built into the company culture and throughout everything that we do, and not bolted on later in the process. And by that, you'll see even in the conversation that we have in the later part of this session, where I show you tools and technologies to build out these Power Apps and build out these Power BI with accessibility in mind. What we're trying to do is put it in the life cycle of development and not just as an afterthought, right? We don't want to think of it as something that just comes later in the process, but something that is built into our process, right? So we're passionate about creating products and services that really are accessible, and we are now taking that integrated approach to exclusion, right? So we have to prioritize embedding accessibility into the DNA of the company and really including that in our culture, systems, and products. Right. So with that, let me just quickly show you, what this means in the development life cycle, right? Built in versus bolted on. So putting accessibility at the heart of design means we make products and services that are accessible to people with disabilities. Now, accessibility needs to be included and defined in the development lifecycle activities of the organization. Now, this includes how to plan, how to design, build and deploy, test and receive feedback to ensure accessibility is built into the lifecycle and is a part of the normal engineering processes, right? So designing for inclusivity not just opens up, our products and services to more people. It really reflects how people really are, right? And embedding these accessibility standards and expectations into daily workflows, enhancing these designer workflows and support, right, and enhancing developer workflows and support. These are really primitive to make sure that we're going with the built-in approach and not the bolted-on approach, right? So these are just some of the examples how an organization, at an organizational level, can look at integrating accessibility into their life cycle, right? On a level one, where teams are aware of basic accessibility developer skills or testing practices, if they have consistency in the delivery of quality accessible code, and just as we move up the level, how is the organization pivoting into taking the built-in approach, right? So I think that was the overview of accessibility at large, how and why we all should care about it and why we all should be building around it, right? With this, let me drill down into the specific topics of today's discussion, which is around accessibility in Power BI reports and accessibility in Power Apps. Just before I start off, while in the first context of the first part of this, I will focus more on the Power BI side and show you more examples from that side. But that being said, a lot of this is replicable, and the same principles really apply on the Power App side as well. So you'll see me talking a lot about the color, the layouts, how we are trying to position a lot of the elements on a Power BI reports. But the principles really at the core of it remain the same. So please carry it forward to the next part of the conversation as well. In Power Apps, I'll maybe spend minimal time talking about the particular tools specific to Power Apps, but the principles really carry forward, right? With that, let me just move on to this section on accessibility in Power BI reports. So Power BI is really giving you all of the pieces for accessible reports, but you must put some of them in place, right? So by that, what I mean is when we're designing for accessibility in Power BI, we can really segment this into three parts of accessibility features. Some of them are built-in accessibility features that really require no configuration. Others are built-in accessibility features which require a configuration. And then I'll share some other tips and considerations that you may keep in mind, and some external tools that you can also use to test for accessibility, to build certain things and custom things for accessibility, right? So that's really the three categories of the conversations that we'll be having with respect to Power BI. So let me just start off with the built-in features, right? So I'll primarily be talking about five things here. One is the screen reader compatibility, right? So when we talk about screen reader compatibility, we're really talking about how somebody who's using a screen reader to read the reports, how are they perceiving the reports. So that is a built-in feature in Power BI that all of our Power BI reports are screen reader compatible, right? So all of the major screen readers across the world, they work well with our Power BI reports, and we can really read the reports with that screen reader. However, there are some things that as an author, as a report author, you must customize to make sure that the screen reader experience is great. And I'll come on to it in the later part of the discussion. The other four things are on keyboard navigation, high contrast colors view, focus mode, and showing the data table. So let me just move on to each one of them, right? Um, can you mute yourself if you're not speaking, please? Kamlesh, can you mute the attendees if they're not talking, please?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you so much. All right. All right. So moving on to the first part, which is on the keyboard navigation, right? So as a report author, you don't have to worry whether your consumers can use their keyboard to navigate through a report, right? So Power BI visuals are natively all keyboard navigable, and your report consumer can walk through the data points in the visuals, switch between those page tabs, and have access to interactive capabilities, including cross highlighting, filtering, and slicing, right? So as a report consumer navigates around a report, the focus will show up to indicate where the user is in the report, and depending on the browser being used, the focus mode may slightly differ, right? But focus for accessibility navigation is existing, and to access the most frequently used keyboard shortcuts, you can also press the question mark to display a keyboard shortcut dialog to and that's how the keyboard navigation part would really work. If you go on to the second bit, which is on high contrast color view, right? So Power BI has high contrast support for reports. So if you're using a high contrast mode in Windows, Power BI desktop will automatically detect which high contrast theme is being used in Windows and apply those settings to your reports as well. Now, those high contrast colors follow the report when published to the Power BI service or elsewhere as well. And the Power BI service can also attempt to detect the high contrast settings, selected for Windows. But at the same time, if you want to like set the theme manually as well, you can do that. As you can see in the screen, you can do that in the Power BI service in the top right corner. You can select the high contrast colors, and then select the theme that you would like to apply to the report. So you can see various themes that are highlighted here: the high contrast number 1, 2, high contrast black or white, right? So that is also something that you can manually select. That's on the high contrast color view. Moving on to the focus mode. Now, to be honest with you, I do not know this is actually an accessibility feature. This is something that is very primary to how I consume my report. And that just really proves, how accessibility for some can mean innovation for all, right? So this has been a really good feature for me to use when I'm consuming report, and, just put certain visuals into focus mode to really focus and concentrate on those particular visuals. So what Power BI does is, if a report consumer is looking at a visual in a dashboard, they can expand that visual to fill up more of their screen by navigating to the context menu of the visual and selecting open in focus mode. So you may have seen that in your Power BI. How in the particular screen you can see on the menu there is that option of opening in focus mode. So really a primary feature that a lot of us use, and also something that helps people with disabilities to consume the reports better. Moving on to the next part, which is on showing data table, right? Like I said, to make a lot of these things, better, as a better experience for the screen readers, we have the show data capability, which is basically, it is a more screen reader friendly table that is created from your visual. So again, this is something that I've used anyway as well, and I found this pretty useful. But for somebody with disabilities, this can be really great to consume the reports properly through a screen reader. So what you can do is to view this in a tabular format, the same visual that I was showing in the earlier slide as well, we can really show this in a tabular format with with Alt Shift F11, and you can just do the show data bit and see how it shows up in a tabular format. So this is really a screen reader friendly approach to showing that visual. I think moving on to the next section, which is around built-in features that require configuration, right? So while Power BI has accessibility features that are built into the product, some also require configuration from the report author, which would be you. And these features include, let's see the first one, which is alt text. Now, alt text or alternative text descriptions. Now, just let me just step out of this Power BI context and just by a show of hands, can you tell me if you've ever, in your on your Facebook, on your Instagram, on any of your social media, have you looked at the alt text that is perhaps automatically generated, or have you looked at or tried to edit that alt text when that is generated for a picture you post? Anybody who has explored or noticed that alt text on any of the social media? Okay, I see a couple of hands. Anybody else who has noticed that or gone ahead and actually edited it to a more accurate description? Super. All right. Great to see a couple of hands on that. So alt text is really not just limited to Power BI, but if you're really passionate about accessibility, I'd encourage you to do this across the board, right? Even on your LinkedIn's, even on your Instagrams and your Facebooks of the world, because that's how we see, alt text are really great for somebody with a screen reader who is really trying to understand what the image holds, right? So alt text or alternative text descriptions are used to describe the appearance and functions of visuals and images on the report page to screen reader users from a Power BI context, right? So report authors should add alt text to really every object that conveys that meaningful information on that report, right? So providing alt text will really ensure that consumers of your report are able to understand what you're trying to communicate with a visual, and even if they cannot see the visual image, shape, or text box, they're able to read that alt text to understand what is really being conveyed through the visual. So you can provide alt text for any object on a Power BI desktop report by selecting that object, such as any visual shape and so on. You can do that on the visualizations pane. You can see on my the first image that I have here, the visualization pane. You can select the format section and expand general, scroll to the bottom and fill in the alt text the text box. The alt text box has that limit of 250 characters that you want to stick to, but really a brief description will help include all the information about the insight that you would like the report consumer to take away from a visual, right? So because a screen reader reads out the title and type of a visual, you only need to fill in a description. So an example of alt text could be, for this particular visual could be net user satisfaction by color of product sold, or further broken down by product class, right? So keep in mind that calling out that insight or specific data points may not be the best thing to do, because this may be, this may be dynamic. Data and Power BI may be dynamic. So if you'd like to use any kind of dynamic alt text, we also have a way to do that, where you can use, DAX measures and conditional formatting to create a dynamic alt text. So screen readers are then able to call out values specific to the data that a report consumer is viewing. So you can see in my last box here, I have also shown, how you can do the conditional formatting for alt text. So that's on alt text. Moving on, I think on the tab order bit, and setting the tab order really helps the keyboard users navigate your report in an order that matches the way users visually process the report visuals, right? So if you including decorative shapes or images in your report, you should really make sure that you remove those from the tab order, right? So I'll actually show you a demo of these things in detail, and I'm just doing a quick time check. Since we're short on time, let me quickly browse through each of the features, and then I'll probably show you all of these in actions for a better understanding. So that's on tab order for anybody who's navigating using a keyboard. Moving on to the next bit on titles and labels, right? You can see how we can do various titles and labels to make sure that this is not just accessible but something that is understandable to all, right? So you can see in the first example where we have CFI totals versus the current year sales, where we have broken down that jargon or abbreviation into actual words there, so to make sure that anybody who reads it can understand it. And you can see on the second image as well, where we have one of the screens with really too much data versus something that is trying to convey with the minimal data, but at the same time it's pointing out how this the trends are ongoing. So we would really want to make sure how we are using titles and labels here to make sure that somebody who's accessing it or any new user who is accessing it is able to understand what this really means. Right, so with data labels, you can even choose to turn on and off the label for each series in your visual, or really position them above or below a series. So if you see in this particular example, you can see how the first visual looks very cluttered in nature, right? And now the second one, just by placing it correctly, how placing the data labels correctly has made it look a lot better. So now that is something that also that you can do to make sure that it's a better experience for the people at the other end. When you talk about markers, it's really the best practice to avoid using color as the only way of conveying information. So instead, you can use markers to convey different cities, right? So for line area combo visuals, you can turn markers on and use a different marker shape for each line, right? So you can see a couple of examples that are listed here, and you can see how markers have been used in different contexts here, right? So if you're not too sure whether your visual or report is too busy, as you would see, in one of the visuals on the right hand side, if you see the first one on the top, it looks like a very visual, a busy visual, versus the second one on the bottom, which is not that busy, and we can see how our eyes are drawn to various section of the report. So really, we have a tool called the squint test here, which can really help you understand and do a test of whether your visual is too busy or not, or whether you should make some changes. I'll maybe pass on that link of that tool, the squint test tool. That is a browser add-in that you can add to really check how your visual is being perceived in that context. Finally, coming on to the themes, contrast, and colorblind friendly colors, right? So this again is something that is a foundational feature, and this is something that will also pass on to the Power App side of the story, right? So if you look at it, certain color combinations are particularly different for users with color vision deficiency to distinguish. So these include the following combinations that I've listed on the screen. You can see green and red, green and brown, blue, purple, and so on, right? So there are certain colors that you would perhaps want to avoid in this context. So you should really typically ensure that your reports have enough contrast between text and any background colors, right? So that is really the foundational principle. And we have a framework, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next slides, which really talks about how we should have a contrast ratio, which is at least of 4.5 to 1. And there are several tools that will help you, check the contrast ratio on your own report colors, right? And you should also consider that some report viewers may have, deficiencies in terms of color vision deficiencies. And for those kind of users, the colors that I've listed on the screen, those would really, be difficult for people with such deficiencies to distinguish, right? So in this sense, we would want to avoid using these colors together in a chart or on the same report page. Now, just a bunch of tips and considerations, and it's 2:10, so I want to quickly move to the next section as well. So let me just give you a quick overview here. There are three things that you must keep in mind when designing for accessibility. Number one is understanding what your audience wants. Second is on keeping your report simple and consistent, and third is on testing for low vision. Right. So first one, understanding what your audience want, how you can really do this is really speak to some of your end users. users, right? Get some feedback from them, see how they are really consuming the reports. The second bit is on keeping your report simple and consistent. I give you a bunch of tips on this, on how you can declutter some of these reports and visuals. And third, on testing for low vision, we have a bunch of tools that can help you do that. Squint test is one of the tools, and I'll talk briefly about a couple of these in the upcoming slides. With that, let me also touch upon a framework that we have. While we have various of them, we talked about universal design, we have some accessibility standards set down, we have the web content accessibility guidelines, which are really foundational in nature. And while I may not be able to talk about all of them, with the constraints in time, but I really want to touch upon this one, which is on web content accessibility guidelines, right? So this is really a key principle when you are looking at designing for accessibility. And what these guidelines do is, they make the guidelines, the key principles are around three things, which is on perceivable, operable, and understandable. Let me just quickly talk about what I mean by each one of them, right? So if you see, the guideline on being distinguishable and the use of color, right? So we talked about this a little before in one of the reports that I was showing you on how color should not be the only means of conveying information. As an example, let's see these two particular things, right? Which is current year sales by product. You can see two tables here. One of the tables is just distinguishing, maybe exceeding revenue by the color coding. You can see the top two, dog treats and dog foods, are in green, and the bottom one is in red. While on the right hand side, you can see that we've also added that column of year and your sales, where we're using that shape also to tell where the revenue has exceeded versus where it is below perhaps a carved out line. So really not using color as the only means of conveying information is one of the guidelines that we lay down in web content accessibility guideline. Another one is on mechanism that is available for identifying specific definitions or words, or basically, how we use idioms or jargon. And this is really common in a lot of corporate organizations, right? And we get so siloed by our own approach and our own, in our own little world, we think everybody really knows this, but a lot of people may not actually understand the jargons that we're using. And this is not just for accessibility, but also if we are showing these reports to somebody external of our organization. So really, as a best practice, you would want to make sure that you don't use abbreviations in most places, right? If you can see on the left hand side, we have CY, sales by product, and on the right hand side, we're talking about how we can break this down into current year sales, and talking about how which currency this is being conveyed on, right? For example, Microsoft really usually tends to talk in dollars, right? And a lot of times when I'm interacting as a partner technology strategist, I go and talk to partners and I talk about it in dollars, right? And they may not know, they may actually think of it in INR because that's how they usually converse in business sense. So really making sure that the end user is also able to understand which currency we're really talking about. So that's another one of the success criteria, and we have a bunch of these listed out in the guidelines, and I'd encourage you to go through the same. In terms of testing visual accessibility, I'll pass on these links since we are short on time. Maybe let me quickly just skim through this, but these are links that you would want to bookmark when you're testing for visual accessibility. So with that, let me switch to the demo that will show you all of these things in action. So basically what I have here is a bad report, right? So I have a bad report here that you can see, and this bad report is basically showing you of various things that can go wrong when you're designing a report, right? So you can see, in this particular table, the blue lines are a bit distracting. We have this particular visual, which looks a little bit too busy, and these vertical, symbols that are really hard to read as such. Again, we have this visual, which is, there are too many colors, and to really explore the entire legend, you need to scroll over to the other side as well. We have the scatter chart, which is not really telling enough, which looks a bit confusing, to be honest, right? And on the other side, we have this tile as well, which again looks a little too busy, too many colors, and really hard to understand. And again, the legend has to be scrolled through to understand. So I think the first thing that we're going to fix around here is on lightening the background. Like I said, We talked about this before, that we would want, as per the guidelines, to have that 4.5 to 1 ratio when we are talking about, the background to the text ratio. So we're really lightening the background color to make sure all the visuals on it are easily readable. Sorry. On the next side of this, one second. Yeah. So on the next side of this, when we're talking about the other bit on, my apologies. Yeah. So when we talk about the other bit on, lightening the background, that's one that we are trying to do, that we just talked about. The second bit would be on clarifying and rearranging these visuals, right? So you can see from the earlier visual, we've gone to this approach where we're doing the sales overview on one side of the table, which is the left-hand side. And then we're going to the right-hand side of the table and showing the rest of the things in terms of, what insights we're really drawing for it. And we're adding these titles and these tiles to each of the slide to make sure that when a screen reader sees it, we are able to, they're able to exactly understand what we're trying to show through it, right? So you can see that in the demo, the title text is being added to make sure that when a screen reader reads it, they're able to understand what exactly we're trying to convey with the visual. So that's the number two thing that we're trying to do here with each of the visuals. Number three, like we discussed before, removing unnecessary jargon and acronyms, right? So we would want to, like we discussed before, having jargon like CY, moving that to current year, sales percent of total dollars, making sure that currency is also added, right? Instead of that abbreviation NSAT, I've just expanded that to net user satisfaction, right? So a bunch of these, expanding that to make sure that anybody who reads it, and anybody with even mental limitations to withhold such information about abbreviations, is able to use the report consistently. And then we can see the fonts consistency, right? So we're making sure that across that entire report, we have fonts that are being used consistently. Again, this is something that goes on to Power Apps as well, that whenever we build a Power Apps, any kind of visual, any kind of fonts, etc., that we would want to have, we would want to keep it consistent throughout the report, throughout the app that we have. You can see the colors also being changed to make sure that they're readable, and that contrast is also fine. Yeah, so the theme colors as well are very important in this sense, to make sure that, as compared to whatever the theme is, we're able to read it properly. Now we're going to check the color contrast here, right? So again, we are going to take this hexagonal value of this particular visual, and then, see how it is comparing to the background visual as well. So, right, so you can see the background hex code and the hex code on the visual being checked with this particular tool. Again, this is a tool that I was showing you earlier. I'll pass on the links to this, but you can see how this is comparing to a guideline on the contrast. And also, this is another tool, another plugin in the browser that can help you see how this is for people who are colorblind. So you can see on the various metrics here, people with various kind of, colorblind disabilities, how they perceive the report, and if this is, accessible to all of them across the spectrum. Again, the Chrome, there's an add-in there that really enabled the person to check that. So I'll pass on the links to that you can go and look at to make sure that your contrast is done right. So with that, I think just considering that we have 10 minutes in the session left, I would want to also cover the second part of the conversation, which is on Power Apps, right? So while a lot of the things remain the same here, there are a bunch of things that I would want to highlight specific to Power Apps, right? So like I said, layout and color, keyboard support, screen reader support, multimedia, working with signatures, all of these things are really consistent across both Power BI and Power Apps. So I've talked about this before, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is something that you must also keep in mind if you are building Power Apps as well, right? In terms of signature, I think since we didn't talk about it before, let me just quickly, address that. So if you have a signature field that uses the pen input control, you need to enable that alternative method of a signature input as well, right? So the recommended way is to show a text input control where a user can type their name and ensure that the signing instructions are placed in the accessibility label property. Now, this accessibility label property is really the key thing in a Power Apps building approach for accessibility, right? And you'll see more of that in the upcoming slides. So when we talk about building for accessibility in Power Apps, we have this really handy tool, which is called the Accessibility Checker. So you can see on my screen, I've pasted a couple of screenshots. So near your app, you have this, little symbol for an accessibility checker, and you can go in and see any kind of accessibility problems with your current Power Apps. So there are three kind of errors that it would typically show you. Here you can see those are listed out. One is errors, the other is warnings, and the third is on tips, right? So there are really three segments of these that we see. And when you drill down into each one of them, you can also see, what is a particular issue that is happening because of that, and how do you fix it, and why should you really fix it. So you can see in this particular context, it's talking about how if focus is invisible, people who don't use a mouse won't be able to see it when they're interacting with the app, right? So why that is really important for you to fix as an accessibility issue. So like I said, there are three, severity of issues. Let me quickly give you three examples of each one of them. So error is basically when, there is an issue that makes the app difficult or impossible to use and understand for users who have a disability, right? So that is when it is classified as an error. If you can see in my particular example, here we don't have that accessible label property that is missing, right? So it's a missing accessible label issue, and there are various ways that are told on how to fix, what is the description, and why fix, and why this is actually highlighted as an error is because if this accessible label property contains no text, people who can't see the screen won't understand what's in images or control, right? So we really need to have this property containing text to make sure that people who can't see the screen are able to understand what's lying in these images in control. Talking about the second bit, which is on warnings, right? So when we look at warnings are really to identify issues. I see a question in the chat window on LinkedIn extension name. I will post these in the chat window right after the session. So I'll just post that screenshot of all the tools that you can use to check the accessibility. All right, so with that, let me just move on. On the second part of it, warnings. So warnings are basically issues that make the app difficult to use or understand for most, but not all users who have a disability, right? With that, if you see the example that I have here is of missing captions, right? So it shows a warning because, without captions, people who have disabilities may not be able to get information from a video or audio segment. Now, this may be not the case for people with the entire spectrum of the disabilities, but for a certain spectrum, this would cause a problem. So that's why this is shown as a warning. Now, when you go on to the tips are basically, things that would help you improve the experience of users who have that disability, right? So when a screen has a default name, here, this is highlighted as a tip where, you revise the screen name, basically to make sure that you're improving that experience of the users. So revising screen name, and why it is important is because people who are blind or have low vision or a reading disability rely on these screen names to navigate using the screen reader, right? So this is really a tip of severity of the issue that would help improve that overall experience when we're building for them. Now, we've talked a lot about, accessibility today, from both a Power Apps perspective, from a Power BI perspective, and even from a general perspective, right? So if there is any other technology also that you are working on, I would encourage you to go explore how you can build it in a more accessible fashion. What are the guidelines that you must follow, right? Some of them that are talked about, and one of the foundational ones being the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Do go have a look on it and see how you can improve the experience overall. I think the parting thought that I would want to leave you with, on this is really, what if we build with inclusiveness in mind, and someone with a disability is able to do their job because of that, right? So just imagine somebody who is able to really use this in a much more productive fashion just because you thought of it in your building life cycle and you made sure that this was always accessible. With that, I think I've gone to the close of my session. I would want to quickly highlight, since this was a question, I'll maybe just skip to the screen on the testing visual accessibility tools that we have. So these are basically some of the tools that we have to test visual accessibility, right? So I talked about the squint test, which is an add-in. You can find that on the Chrome store. A bunch of links that are shared here in terms of the various tools that you can use to test for visual accessibility, right? So I showed you one of the tools which was on color vision deficiency, where you can go and check how this would simulate for somebody with color blindness and various type of them. We have for color contrast, we have for blur tool to make sure that our sides are not too busy. And yeah, you can also do that with mobile device with brightness on low. So that's pretty much it from my end. I think I'll just paste, these important links in the chat window. If there is any other question, while we've drawn to the close of the session, so I perhaps may not be able to take it as part of the session, but maybe I can take it at the end of it. I can paste my answers on the chat window. And you can also always reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will paste again my credentials here, my email address if you wish to write to me, and we can really connect and see if you want to explore this further and understand any of the things better.
Thanks, Priyansha, for the wonderful session.
Hey, thanks, Kamlesh. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining the session today. I hope this was useful to you and will be useful as you, build around your accessibility journey. I have just pasted my LinkedIn as well, and I'm typing in my official email address as well if you wish to drop me a note or connect over anything else around this. Would be happy to connect, would be happy to, take up any other questions that you may have. Any questions before we close off?
No, Priya, that's it.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you
good.
so much, everyone, for joining today. Thanks a lot, and have fun in the next session. I'm pretty sure it'll be very productive for you and very useful as we go along the rest of the day and the rest of the exciting sessions. Thanks a lot for joining today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.